In this demo, I want to show you how to use the update source trigger property on a binding to control exactly when data flows in a two-way data binding scenario. By default, as we've talked about before, when you've got a two-way data bound scenario here, the point where data flows is when you tab out of the field, and that's called lost focus. That is the default update source trigger for most bindings. I'm going to drop into the XAML here and add a couple of labels and text boxes, which we can show up down here as source and target, two different text boxes. And the way the bindings are set up here between these is that you can see the source text box has no binding, so it's just going to reflect whatever is put into it as a source object. The target text box has its text bound, but it's using an element name binding, which we covered earlier, to point to the source text box as a source object. And because the path that we point to is a dependency property, that's going to raise change notifications, and we should see the target update whenever the source value changes. So that means for every character that we put into the text property is changing, and it's going to update the target to reflect that. Now notice this update source trigger equals property change. If I leave it on default, once I start putting stuff in the source, you can see that the target stays in sync on every keystroke. However, if I go to the target and start putting stuff in, the source does not update until I tab out of the field. And then the source is updated because of the focus change. So the default update source trigger is really a focus change for most elements. So if I change this to property change, it basically says every time the target property changes, which is the text property of this text box, go ahead and push its current value down into the source object's property. So now we're going to get fully synchronized. If we start up, source is raising property change on every keystroke because the text of the source is changing. But now on every keystroke in the target, it's pushing the current value of the text of the target down into the source property. So basically when you want the source set immediately every time the bound property changes, then you want to use the property change on update source trigger. This is especially good for validation scenarios where you want immediate feedback to the user and not wait until they tab out of the field. Now you can see here there's actually four choices there. There's default and lost focus, which for most controls mean exactly the same thing, lost focus. The place where they're different is if you're inside of a data grid. If the bound control is inside of a data grid, default means losing focus on the row that the control is within, whereas lost focus means losing focus on the cell that the control is within. But for single controls like a text box, default and lost focus mean the same thing. We covered property change. Explicit is a mode where you actually have to use a programmatic call against the binding itself to tell it when to flow the data. So data is not going to flow automatically in any case. You have to tell it to flow the data, and it's fairly rarely used.